Right. So I'll give you a little bit of a context about how this live happened. I think a few months ago, there was a post on one of the Facebook forums that I moderate, which has to do with the Deccan history and heritage. It's called Hyderabad Trails. Hyderabad is a city in central India. It's a city with a lot of history and a lot of heritage. And I was surprised to see a post by Amber where I think you were inquiring about some medieval paintings. And I've seen that you're quite active in these Facebook groups which have to do with Indian heritage, art, and history. So yeah, that is when I first saw your work. And recently I saw a post from you that you started a bakery, and very interestingly, you have named most of your bakes from historic women from all over the world, most of these from folk tales. And I found that to be very fascinating as well. And that was when I came to know about your research thesis for your master's, which has to do with medieval or post-medieval Indian art. And I was quite interested in the kind of work that you did in your research. And hence I requested Amber Peters to join us on a live and tell us more about the research thesis that she did on the medieval, post-medieval Central Indian art history, right? And for somebody from Canada to be doing her thesis or choosing to do her thesis on a topic like medieval Indian art history was quite a curious thing for me. And hence I was very keen to learn more about what interested her about medieval Indian history or Indian art history, and hence this live session. I see that more people have joined us. There are almost 9 people watching us live.
Awesome.
Yeah, and let's quickly ask people where they're joining from. How many of you are from Hyderabad, and how many of you are joining from Canada? Would somebody care to just comment and let us know where you're joining us from? I see Geet SM, most likely from India. Indian name, but could also be from
Canada. We have so many Indians here.
I see.
So many
Lost
all over Canada.
Welcome. There's somebody called Lost in Time and Space who just joined us. So this is a live with Amber Peters. We are going to discuss her research thesis on medieval Indian art history, especially to do with the Deccan region. But before we start off, I would like to hear a few voices from people. Okay, so there's Dr. Jacqueline, your mother from British Columbia. Insta Ladai 21st just said lol. There's Geet from the USA and Veggie Veg from Alberta. There seems to be more people joining from Canada than from India. So anyway, welcome to all of you. And I'm looking forward to learning about Amber's work, and also, very interested to hear her stories and listen to her share more about her work. Right? For those of you who do not know Amber Peters, I'd like to give a very short, brief intro. Well, looks like most of the listeners are your friends anyway, but for those who are joining from India Trails, Amber Peters did her master's from University of Alberta in Canada. And very curiously, the topic of her thesis is a couple of paintings from post-medieval Deccan, the Golconda art. And these have very curiously to do with an animal, mythical, mythical if you so believe, or a real animal if you believe. It's called Buraq, right? And I did not know about Buraq before I heard it from Amber. And I'm guessing that some of you probably would not have heard of Buraq before. So be prepared to be amused about this very fascinating animal. But I'll let Amber tell you more about it. Amber did her master's from University of Alberta, and very recently she started a home baking business, and it's called the High Rise Bakery. That's the account from which we're going live right now. All right, so over to Amber. A little bit about myself. My name is Gopala Krishna, and I live in the Himalayan mountains of India. And I'm a traveler, and I run this small initiative called India Trails, through which I offer heritage walks and guided walking tours of various destinations in India. And this started with a city in India called Hyderabad, also the city from where the paintings happen to be from. But I also worked in various destinations in India like Jaipur, Pondicherry, Delhi, and a few other cities. So, so that's the end of the intros. Over to Amber. Let's hear from her about her thesis a little bit. And I'll probably ask her a few questions. Feel free to ask her questions through your comments as well. And then we'll have a presentation from her, which will be a very quick synopsis about the 400-odd page thesis that she did as a part of her master's. Over to you, Amber.
Thank you so much, Gopala. It's really an honor to be here because, as you said, there's not a lot of people studying Indian history from Canada. Maybe like, I don't know, 5, if that, not a lot at all. So, sitting here during the pandemic by myself in my home, like everyone was, in this very cold city, again, not at all like Hyderabad. It was so great to see these lives going on that Gopala was doing, because Gopala started these amazing heritage walks in Hyderabad, which were super successful, and from which, he has grown and does a more all-India sort of focus. And I never really thought that I'd be on the other side. I could kind of virtually visit Hyderabad when there's no traveling, nothing else going on, and now it's such an honor to be here and to share about my thesis. Usually you write some super long thing, the supervisors read it. Does anyone else read it? Probably not. So it's really great to talk about. I'll start by showing you the paintings that I wrote about. So you can see one here. This is from Golconda, about 1770 to 1780, or sorry, 1670 to 1680, around there. And then you have another painting which looks very similar. I basically figured out they're copies of one another, just in a slightly different style, from Hyderabad in 1770, 1780, around there. You can see a woman's face, you can see a dragon's tail, you can see 4 legs, and I don't know how well you can see in here, but there's so many animals within the body of the Buraq. But maybe I'll give a quick intro just for people who don't know what is the Buraq. So in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, he went on a night journey, and he goes first to Jerusalem, and then he's able to go to the heavens and see, have a meeting with God and all of this sort of thing. And when he goes there, he flies on an animal, and this animal is called Buraq, which the word Buraq in Arabic just comes from the word lightning. But even though there isn't much mention of it in the Quran, people imagine it as some kind of flying horse, flying ungulate. But every version, everybody has kind of maybe a different idea of what this animal looks like. And one way too that some people who aren't familiar with the Miraj, the story of Isra and Miraj, it is said, or it's most likely that Dante, a lot of people might have read Dante's Inferno, or that when they were in school or heard of the Divine Comedy, a lot of people think that his journey to go see the heavens and see hell and all of that was actually inspired by the story of Isra and Miraj from the Prophet. He didn't really like Muslims, but he still copied some things from them anyway. So people, that's maybe something to connect to the Western world as well.
Right. Very interesting. How did you come to hear about the Buraq for the first time? And how did you chance upon these paintings from medieval days?
For most Muslims, like I'm a Muslim, and most Muslims know about the Buraq and know about Isra and Miraj and stuff, though for most people it's not really something you think about day to day. But I became really interested in it because I love animals, I love creatures, I love art and these things. And the Buraq is actually, when it comes to Islamic art, especially when you're talking about figural art, because a lot of Muslim communities don't do paintings of animals or animals or humans and that sort of thing. Though a lot of communities did, some communities didn't. But the communities that did really love the image of the Buraq. Even today, like if you go to Pakistan, there's, most people paint their trucks. Most trucks are very beautifully painted, and it's very common to have a painting of the Buraq on those trucks, even now. So it's something that I think is fascinating to a lot of people, and I was really interested to see. And I think especially because we don't have any scripture that says all of these details of what it looks like. So people could use their imaginations and try to imagine, hey, what could this animal be what could this animal look like?
Right. And what were the first images of Buraq that you saw? And did you find any difference between the way Buraq has been depicted in South Asia, Pakistan, India, and Buraq that is depicted elsewhere? Because I was doing a quick Google image search of the Buraq, and I found a lot of images actually from India. And I saw some really beautiful calendar art and matchbox art. We have these paintings from the middle of the century, the 20th century, where very beautiful paintings were used on matchbox covers. And I saw some really interesting Buraq paintings on these matchbox covers. Probably got to do with the fact that there was more lenience of depicting such living creatures within the Islamic community in regions of Persia, India, Indonesia, and countries like this, as opposed to communities elsewhere. Probably that's the reason. But did you also see a lot of these Buraqs from other cultures around the world?
So when I was starting my thesis, I knew I wanted to write about the Buraq, but I didn't know. And I knew I wanted to write about art, but I didn't know which painting what I wanted to focus on. So I actually made a map, finding every single Buraq that I could find, at least that, of ones that I could, find in a museum, that I could say, I know where it's from, I know when it's from, and it's properly documented. I was mostly looking at older historical examples. And through that map, I could kind of see certain trends about how the animal was depicted. The one thing that's common is it always looks like some sort of ungulate. It always has 4 legs. It always has four legs. It looks kind of like, whether it's a deer or a horse or something like that, changes. And the majority of the time it has a female human face. Not always. One place where I saw that it didn't have a human face was actually kind of somewhere you wouldn't expect, was an advertisement for like basically beef stock from Germany. In the early 20th century, and it had a painting of the Prophet on a flying horse to advertise. I don't know why, but basically to advertise soup. So some of those were really different. In India, it's very common. One feature that's very common is a tail with that peacock's tail. That's one thing that's peculiar to India, I would say.
Right. And I find the 2 particular paintings that you choose to be very peculiar because of the tails having dragon heads on them. And, it's surprising because dragons are not, as an idea, as an idea of a mythical creature, they're not from India, they're from China. So for an Indian painting with a very Indian head of the Buraq to have a very Chinese depiction of a dragon on its tail is quite amusing. And I haven't seen too many paintings from that part of, or at least that period of time with Chinese motifs on them. So once again, that raises a lot of questions for me. Do you have any idea where the Chinese head comes from, the dragon head in this painting?
Yeah, so actually, the idea of dragons, like all dragons, like the idea of dragons originally comes from China, but I don't know exactly, but I'm imagining maybe around like from Silk Road or something like that, through trade, whatever. It started to spread, and dragons started being depicted in Iranian and Persian manuscripts and Iranian paintings, especially. And this particular dragon head looks exactly like the kind of dragons that you would see in Persian manuscripts. And it's the same way. It's that the idea of dragons, they might be not as popular so much in India today, but there are stories from that period that have dragons in them. Not a lot, because, well, there's lots of other, mythical type creatures that you can choose from. But there are some, but the same way that dragons came and are in, folk tales and stories from Europe and the UK and so forth. They also went to Iran, and less so, but sometimes to India.
So that's wonderful to hear you speak about the Buraq. I see that some new people have also joined. Let me just tell you that we're doing this live with Amber Peters from Alberta, Canada, and we're talking about her master's research, which is about Al Buraq, some paintings depicting Al Buraq from post-medieval Deccan history. So before I hand it over to you so that you can talk about your research in a little bit more detail, I would like you to ask you about your latest business, which is a home-based bakery, the High Rise Bakery. You have chosen to name most of your bakes on historical and mythical characters of women from all over the world, from cultures across the world. So could you tell a little more about your most popular bakes and the people, either real or folk, that have inspired those bakes?
So I decided to name each of my cakes after a woman from a different part of the world, and each cake I designed every single element to have something to do with the traditions of desserts in that country. It's my own kind of interpretation. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to compete with your grandmother, like when it comes to the traditional stuff, we like what's in our family and that's great, but I wanted something that would honor different cultures and honor different people. And I thought, especially because I think a lot of people see tradition and traditional things as being something that's oppressive, but to me, I felt like most women don't end up in history books. Most women, we don't hear about them, we don't know who they are. But so many women, grandmothers and so forth, they pass down their legacy through their food. So to me, I want to honor that tradition, and I name it after a woman who we have heard about. And for maybe one example, I have one cake that's named after Noor Jahan. Many people probably know. She was a Mughal empress, so to say, who was a very strong woman, very, some people say she not that she took over taking care of the empire, but she had a very large role. And that cake, I decided to do a hot milk cake, which is actually from southern United States. But I thought, since so many South Asian desserts involve milk, condensed milk, all different ways to prepare milk, I really wanted to have milk to be in that cake. And then I put in the middle, I have a pistachio kind of croquant that I make, and that's, again, pistachio is a common thing that you have in South Asian desserts, and also it's a little bit, regal, or nuts are expensive, so, I imagine an empress would want to eat that. And then for the decoration, I have out of marzipan, which is almond paste, kind of it's sort of like almost like a dupatta, a piece of cloth, and that's because Noor Jahan was really into textiles. She commissioned textiles, had a big part in the textile industry in Canada. And then I have a rose as well, because I don't know, I feel like roses are such a characteristic Mughlai thing. There's rose gardens, there's lots of roses. So that each cake, unfortunately, when it comes to the painting, I can't just go and ask who painted it and say, hey, why did you choose to do this? But for my cakes, you can always just ask me. I know there's a reason behind everything, and I'm always happy to talk about it.
Sounds very delicious. Next time, probably when you're baking, we can do a live to see how you do them and hear stories about these fascinating women from you. But for now, we're talking about these two medieval paintings from Golconda. So over to you. Just give us a brief summary. I know it's a 400-page document.
Only like 75, I think, in the end.
Okay, so you
150. They made me cut it to 75. I was very sad.
So people are finding the descriptions of your cakes very yummy. I can see that they're definitely interested in hearing or watching you bake the next time while listening to the stories of these women. Yep. So for now, let's hear about your research thesis from the horse's mouth, as they say, from you. Right. If people have questions, they could put it in the comment box, and you can take the questions as and when you feel like. Right. I'll be free to ask you questions directly. But those who are watching the live, they could probably post their comments if they have any queries. Right. So over to you. Tell us more about your research.
Great. So this research was, it was a really long journey, I have to say. It was really a struggle. It took me a long time to get to a conclusion of these paintings, because the resources are so little here in Canada, you know, like I think it's really a shame. You know, you go to the library, and if I wanted to find a book about, say, the general history of the Deccan, you know, something very broad, you've got like 5 books. This is what you get in the library. If you go to the library and you want to read about Charles Baudelaire, like literally one person, you have 2, I looked once, you have 2 entire bookshelves full of books just about one person, but the whole Deccan gets like this. So it was a struggle. So, but what I decided to do as my message was, I looked at literature. I looked at literature because I thought, I have to look at what are these motifs, like the dragon, like the animals. What did they mean to people? And to me, I looked at their stories and said, what role do these animals play in the stories that people would have known in this area at that time? So I started with the dragon, as you can see, because this is something that is peculiar to this region. I've never seen any other depiction of the Buraq that has a dragon. I tried to figure out, what is the purpose of a dragon? Why? So I read a few different stories in mostly in Persian, that because if people don't know, the Persian was like the language of court. It was a language that was very much used in South Asia at the time. Some people don't probably wouldn't know that for at one period there were actually more Persian speakers in South Asia than there were in Iran. More people spoke Persian, not as their first language necessarily, but a lot of people could speak it. So these stories were a big part of Indian culture. And in these stories, dragons were very similar to the way we see them in European fairy tales. You have a man, usually a man, goes on a quest, encounters a dragon along the way, slays the dragon, keeps going. So I had to look, okay, so it seems like the dragon he's an adversary. He's not something you think is spiritual, that's nice. It's something you need to conquer. And then I also found a depiction of a dragon in hagiography, which is like a story about saints, about Sheikh Ardebili, who's coming from Ardabil in like kind of greater Iran. And the way he talked about the dragon as an embodiment of the ego.
I see.
So this was the key to my entire interpretation of the Buraq paintings, when I thought, wow, so what it's telling me, and when I looked at, again, more text, just keep reading, is that this is part of a person's journey. Because again, the Buraq is a spiritual animal, it has to have something to do with religion. It's part of your spiritual journey, and you are conquering your ego along the way. To me, that's what the dragon is in the Buraq. So that was the biggest key to my analysis.
It gives a whole different meaning to the phrase "slaying your dragons," right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very, very fascinating. And how did you exactly try to figure out more about these paintings, these 2 paintings that you found? What sort of clues, what sort of connections did you find with the Golconda dynasty that probably helped you understand these paintings better?
I actually I didn't look as much into political history. I didn't find it was as useful as literature in my interpretation, which I find is maybe like unconventional, because I think the most common way to interpret paintings is from the view of politics. And I thought maybe there's something else. But what I did learn is I have a guess that these paintings are connected to Sufi communities. And Sufi communities, there are so many Sufi communities all over the Deccan, and they were very closely attached to the rulers in the Deccan. And in some ways, there's stories about that sometimes there would be some Sufi sheikh who's really well known, really powerful, and he would even say, he'd say, oh, I have a dream or I have a vision that this person is going to become king, or this person is going to, and it's almost like he's appointing that person. he can get almost as much power as the actual ruler of the place. So that was something that kind of told me that, again, there were a lot of other clues, but made me think that maybe this has to do with Sufism, because again, this idea of a journey is connected to Miraj. People call it the personal Miraj. They compare the personal spiritual journey of going through and trying to, conquer your dragons, learn to be a better person, get a connection to God. And they compare that to the prophet's journey of going to God. So that made me think of that this must be connected to Sufi communities or Sufi philosophy.
Right. Now that you mentioned the Sufi communities, I think that I've seen depictions of Al Buraq near the Sufi shrines and near the chillas. You find them in every nook and corner of Hyderabad. And the image of Al Buraq is definitely very common, even though we've seen it several times. I personally did not know that it was Al Buraq until you mentioned it. But now that I know about it, I can recollect that I've seen depictions of Al Buraq at several places, most likely at Sufi destinations, at Sufi shrines.
Oh, that's good. That's really good to hear.
Right. And, even the idea of ascending on a winged horse, I think that could also be very metaphorical, because Sufis are, they're about higher states of consciousness.
Right.
So the idea of ascending to higher planes on a winged horse probably again is a metaphor, for all we know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where I also further was thinking that it's connected to Sufi communities, is because what I thought about it was, when you're going on a spiritual journey, or any journey, in theory you can go by yourself, but in generally the convention is in Sufi communities, you attach yourself to a Sufi leader who guides you on that journey. And I thought it's the same thing like the Prophet. In theory, the first journey he does is to Jerusalem. In theory, he could have walked to Jerusalem, but would have taken a really long time, much faster to fly on an animal. And I think it's the same way that I think the idea is that the Sufi spiritual leader is similar to the Buraq, in that it's a friend, it's a helper who can help you get to that destination faster, who can help you with your journey. And even, I think in terms of the Buraq, in terms of these paintings, I think they are talking about Sufi spiritual leaders. But when it comes to, as an individual, how you can see what that has to do with your life, like you can have helpers in all sorts of ways. It can be your family, it can be a mentor, it can be anyone like that. Yeah, we can do things on our own, but it's nice to have someone to kind of coach us along.
Right. Very interesting. Now, I also would like to tell you that just like Sufism was within the gambit or within the purview of the Islamic spirituality, we also had another movement in India at around the same time that we call the Bhakti movement. It was a similar spiritual movement that happened within the Hindu fold. And both movements, the Sufi and the Bhakti, they learn from each other, they influence each other. And in the Bhakti movement, the metaphor for the soul ascending into higher planes, the metaphor is that of a swan that's flying. So it's very possible that, in the Sufi culture, the idea of ascending on a winged horse, or maybe they used Al Buraq as a metaphor for the same thing, because that was an idiom that they already had within their culture. It's possible that, these were similar ideas across two spiritual movements that were more or less contemporary. I've hosted Sufi walks in Hyderabad. I used to take people to these dargahs where qawwalis would happen. And, these are very interesting and fascinating tours, which were quite popular in Hyderabad. And while I was doing these walks, I did a bit of research on Sufism, how it originated, how it was influenced, etc. And I could see that there were a lot of parallels between the Bhakti movement and the Sufi movement. Both of these were actually lineages. In Sufi you have the silsila, in the Bhakti you have the parampara, which means that every teacher initiates a student through a ritual. and then passes on the knowledge, and the student then becomes a teacher for another student. So this is a continuous chain of teachers and students that sometimes goes as far as 15 generations and 20 generations. Some of the Sufi silsilas that exist today started in the 1300s, 1400s, and they've been a continuous chain of teachers and disciples for the last 500, 600 years. So, and I mean, that's not the only similarity. There are many similarities, in fact, between the Indian spiritual movements and Sufism, which also more or less originated here. The kind of Sufism that we practice in India, in a way, originated and was influenced heavily from the local movements. We also have spirituality in Iraq and other parts of the world, but they're very different from the kind of Sufism that is practiced in India. So just wanted to give you a little bit of context. Also wanted to share that the first time I heard of Buraq was from an Arabian friend in Hyderabad. And he was describing Buraq as a lightning fast animal. Yeah. Right? You know, people would see it, and in the blink of an eye, they would see that the horse had gone like, when they beyond their eye span. You know, it was out of their sight. And when the line of sight was very clear, which meant that within a split second, this horse had traveled, I don't know, hundreds of kilometers probably, or dozens of kilometers. So that was the first description of the horse that I heard. So it's not surprising that Buraq, which means lightning, probably the name was given because the horse traveled as fast as lightning. I mean, probably that's the reason, because the word itself means lightning. So we have a question from Insta Ludite. What is an Arabian living in Hyderabad? Okay, so we have Hyderabad has people living from Yemen, Arabia, Iraq, Persia. I mean, not just today, but for the last 400 years, we had people from all these cultures live in Hyderabad, primarily because the rulership of the city of Hyderabad, or the kingdom of Hyderabad, they originally were from Persia. So a lot of Persians of Iranian descent, of course, they've mingled with the locals, and now they are very much Indians, but they still trace their lineage back to these tribes in Iran, some of them in Arabia. In India today, we have a very common surname called Qureshi, right? So all the people who have this surname Qureshi, they originated from a tribe called Quraysh, somewhere in Arabia. So we had a lot of it, because for Arabians, it was just, the Indian Ocean. They just get on a ship, cross the Indian Ocean, and the same for Persians, and then they come directly to the west coast of India. Most of them came to trade, but a lot of people also came here to make a fortune, because in those days, India was where the world would come to. Just like today, there's a lot of migration to the west. In those days, there was a lot of migration to India, because this was where people would come to trade. This was where people would come to make a fortune, to make a living. So we have a lot of stories from history of people who came from different parts of Africa, even places like Ethiopia, which was at that time called Habshi Desh. Abyssinia was called Habshi Desh in the local language. So we have entire colonies of people from Ethiopia who came to Hyderabad in the 1600s. We have a colony called AC Guards, Africa. And they come to Hyderabad in the 1700s to join the king's armies. And we have a whole area called Barkas in Hyderabad, which has complete Yemeni settlement. It's called Little Yemen or Little Arabia of Hyderabad. You go in, you have Arabian food, everybody dressed in Arabian clothes, speaking Yemeni language. So yeah, that's to give you a brief about the cosmopolitan nature of Hyderabad's culture. And that has to do, and it's a similar case with most cities as well. You take Delhi, you take other medieval cities in India, you would find that there are considerable populations of people from other parts of the world. So anyway, so I had to take that question because it was about Hyderabad. But over to you if you have something more to share about Buraq or some fascinating things that you found in your research.
There's always lots to talk about. Thank you for adding that. I've actually read there's a lot of scholars who talk about what you were saying about the connections between Sufism and the Bhakti movement. And most people think, like, again, when it comes with influence, it's hard to say what comes from what, but there was definitely a lot of sharing going on. And I think too, like, back in the day, we kind of put on our own biases about how people think about their identity based on how we think about our identity today, which may not be the same. You know, the terms that we use to describe ourselves may not be the same. For example, if you look at earlier texts, they don't usually say Hindus and Muslims. They usually say Hindus and Turks. They don't call them Muslims most of the time. They call them Turks. And it's more about they're using terms of ethnicity rather than terms of religion. And these things always fluctuate in terms of, how people would describe themselves. And I think so many things, like especially with Sufism, for example, there's a lot of hierarchy where, sure, you can be someone who's officially initiated into a Sufi community and you find a teacher and you talk with him and spend that, learn all the details. But then you can have some people, like I was reading one article, which is one of my favorite articles, where he talks about these women who were from villages, who were possibly Hindu women. Again, I don't know how they would call themselves in terms of their religious identity, but they're not necessarily Muslims, they're not initiates into a Sufi community, but they would go to these Sufi khankas, these dargahs, sing the songs, learn the songs, and then when they went back to their communities, when they were spinning, spinning spread or, grinding spices or something like that, that was really laborious, that it took a long time, they would make songs based off of the ones that they heard in the Sufi communities that were a hybrid between the two. So it's just, I think that's one thing that I find, and what I like about these paintings is that everyone can connect with it on a different level. For example, like I read a lot of literature and there's stories that, sure, you can read into it, and a lot of people do read into it and think about Sufi theology, and it's very complex and it's very high level. But you can also, like, there are also stories that are entertaining. You can also just listen to the story and think, oh, that's fun. This prince goes on this journey and a lot of exciting things happen. There's romance and all of that. And I think it's great to have art that you can appreciate on so many levels. It can be on a level of entertainment, or it can be on a level of, religion. And I think too, even though visual art sometimes isn't always a big part of Muslim culture, it really can be, because we have to put into context that back in the day, the majority of people couldn't read. They couldn't pick up a Quran and read it and understand what it says. They couldn't pick up anything and understand what it says. Even today in Pakistan, the majority of people can't read, even now. So seeing a painting is something that anyone can look at a painting and see it, or as long as you're not blind, but the majority of people can look at a painting and see it. And I think having these different ways to connect with religion, to learn, whether it's or with religion or anything, to improve yourself, whether it's a painting or a story or a book that you read, it doesn't matter. It's just great to have so many different ways for people to connect with each other and learn about themselves and learn about other people.
Right. And there's a very famous example from the Delhi history of a king called Akbar who could not read. So Akbar actually commissioned an illustrated depiction of the entire story of Ramayana. So that he could appreciate the story visually while listening to the story, because he could not read. He never learned to read in his life. The other thing I also wanted to point out is that, just like you mentioned, the Muslims at that time in the Deccan, they were called Turks, right? The Telugu word, which is the regional language of Deccan in the state of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, the word for Muslims in this language even today is Turks, because I think the first Muslims came from Turkey. So Turka is the word that is used to represent Muslims, even though today it has taken a certain derogatory sense to the word. Likewise, I wanted to tell you that even the word Hindi or Hindu is also a regional identity. It was never a religious identity, because it comes from the region Hindustan, or the region of the Sindh River, Indus. So the first references to the land of Hindustan, or the people who were called Hindus, it was very much an ethnic reference and not a religious reference, just like you mentioned with Turkey. We have a question coming from Veggie Veg. What topic are you interested in conducting research on next if you continue to your PhD? That's an interesting question.
Oh, it's a big question. I haven't picked a specific topic, but I have to say I really enjoyed learning about this region and this history and this period as well. I like that kind of, late medieval, early modern period. At this time, this is kind of where in the South you're transitioning from kind of independent states, and then the Mughals kind of take over. There's a lot of changes happening, and I still want to look at art. I still want to look at literature, and I'm interested maybe Bijapur, I don't know, maybe Hyderabad. I still want to stick with this region. And one text that I used a lot is called the Gulshan-e-Ishq. I really love it. And if anyone has time to look up, the paintings are gorgeous, and it's never been translated to English because it's in Deccani Urdu, which from like 500 years ago, which the language has changed, of course. So I don't think anyone has bothered to translate it. So one thing that, I don't know if it's necessarily for my PhD, but it would be my dream to be able to translate that text and to be able to actually read it, in complete.
Right. And how much of Urdu do you already speak, or you already know?
I can understand a lot. Honestly, especially in high school, I watched like a lot of Bollywood movies and stuff like that. So I could pick up a lot of words from watching Bollywood movies. But in terms of being able to speak, not really. But I'm hoping. Right now I'm actually studying Persian or Farsi, which has a lot of overlap with Urdu, and I don't know, but the Urdu of 500 years ago might have been closer to modern Persian than it is to modern Urdu. So I'm hoping that slowly can learn Persian and then learn Urdu, but it's a long ways to go, because unfortunately in my province there are no in-person classes for Persian or Urdu at all. There's no option to study that here in person. Right now I'm doing an online study, but yeah, hopefully this is my dream to be able to speak properly.
Right. Fascinating to hear all that. I'll just quickly scroll down to see if there were more questions. There was one question about how many Arabians would be living in the city of Hyderabad right now. So that's a difficult question for me to answer, because a lot of these Arabians are of Arabian descent. Today, they are very far from being Arabian, because they probably do not speak language anymore. And to a large extent, probably they're even disconnected from their cultural roots of Arabia. But they still carry the names, they still carry probably certain words and a few practices or a few culinary habits from those parts. But definitely, I would say it's in thousands. It's in tens of thousands. But there are more Persians definitely in Hyderabad than there are Arabians. As I said, there's a whole area of Hyderabad which is called Barkas, which is a few square kilometers. And these are very densely populated parts of the city. So tens of thousands at least, to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to ask your questions in the comments. And I'm sure Amber will be very happy to take your questions. It could be anything about her journey, her research, or it could also be anything about Deccan history, Deccan medieval art. And, even I could pitch in and answer a question or two if it's something that falls within my domain of knowledge. Right. So while I wait for the questions, I also see that Senthil is watching this video. Hi, Senthil. He's a friend of mine. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask them here. Do you mean Arabians or of Yemeni descent? Both. Both. There are people of Arabian descent as well as Yemeni descent. More Yemenis than Arabians, of course, but there are also people of pure Arabian descent. And a lot of these people carry their stories of sea voyages, stories of um, you know the villages where they came from. They have these tribes which they call the tribe of the black sheep, the tribe of the the white sheep, and phrases like that. But yeah, one thing that fascinates me is, especially with respect to the art of Deccan, human faces. The depiction, the art of, or the depiction of living things. In Urdu, there's a word for that. It's called makhluk, I guess. So the depiction of makhlooks, or living creatures with faces and limbs in Islamic art is a topic of contention in present day Hyderabad, because more and more people are shifting towards a more fundamentalistic idea, or a more extreme view of art in Islam, that depiction of anything living is forbidden in Islam. Now, this is an argument that has existed since the time of the Mughals, because if you see, Akbar commissioned a whole book of paintings, and the king who came afterwards, Aurangzeb, absolutely was unhappy with any depiction of any living things anywhere. And I happen to take a lot of people from different parts of the world, especially from Islamic cultures across the world, Persia, Arabia. And when they come to Hyderabad, I take them to these medieval monuments, like the tombs and the mosques. And several of them are quite surprised to see human depictions, sorry, no, not human, animal depictions, even on the walls of mosques. And it's just inconceivable that you have a mosque with a depiction of a lion, or a living thing for that matter. So it just goes on to show the remarkable diversity even within the fold of Islam, because there's so many countries, so many cultures, and increasingly when these cultures also cross-pollinate, you see that a lot of conflicts arising out of these different beliefs and different ideas of what represents Islam and Islamic art. So, in your research, did you see the diversity of depiction of these creatures within Islamic art? Did you study also Islamic art from other parts of the world, or other parts of South Asia, and any observations on that?
Yeah, so for my thesis itself, I was just focusing on these paintings, but when I was at the earlier stages, when I was trying to find all these images of the Buraq, you can see a very stark regional difference in terms of where you can find lots of images of the Buraq and when you can find fewer. I think there's a misconception. Some people think that, oh, it's Sunnis versus Shias, that Shias allow and Sunnis don't. Historically, that doesn't seem to carry. Some of the oldest depictions of the Buraq of the Prophet of humans and animals are from Iran, but before the Shia period, because Iran had Sunni rulers before. You have depictions from then. So I found almost all of my depictions, the depictions of Buraq that I found, are what there's a scholar who calls it the Balkans to Bengal complex. So basically from Balkans to Bengal, or also including actually Philippines and Indonesia, have a lot of depictions of the Buraq of humans, animals, and so forth, at least in historical periods. In Arab countries, in terms of, Morocco, stretching from Morocco to like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, not a lot. There's not a lot. That's, I think, where you have maybe more strict prohibitions on paintings of animals or humans, because I don't think I found any depictions of the Buraq from those regions. Not to say that there aren't any, but I didn't find any. So there's definitely big regional differences in terms of how Muslims are doing art. From Arab countries, you have what's more popular is geometric art and calligraphy. But that's everywhere. But calligraphy is another big way for people who don't want to paint humans and animals. Writing is its own art form.
Right. And interestingly, last night I was doing a quick Google search of Al-Buraq images, and there was one image from Persia with actually Prophet Muhammad depicted on the Al-Buraq. And I think even in India today, if that painting was to be printed somewhere, a lot of people would take very serious offense. But I guess back in the days in Persia, it was quite a normal thing. That painting that I saw was from the reign of Shah Tasmat, the two, I
Oh,
believe.
so it's a little bit later.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So we have a question from Mami Jan, which speaking of the Buraq, something similar is prominently featured at the shrine of Sayyid Ahmad Badepa in the first Lancers near Mehdipatnam. Would you have come across that? Yes. A lot of depictions of, I was just, before I think you joined in, I was telling Amber that when I was looking at the pictures of Al Buraq, it seemed very familiar, even though I've never heard of it. I could find a familiarity with Al Buraq, and that's when I realized that I've seen depictions of Al Buraq in Hyderabad. In a lot of street corners, you have these chillas. Chillas basically are places where Sufi saints lived for a period of time and hence sanctified. So disciples would go light a lamp. They would tie these holy cloths around a tree and do things like that. And on the wall, you would have paintings, usually paintings of lions and tigers. And I believe at these dargahs and at these chillas is where I've seen a lot of paintings of Al-Buraq, of these horses, these images of the horses. So, Mami Jan says thank you for this interesting discussion. A discussion that we purportedly wanted to have is almost coming to an end. We've been talking for the last 45 minutes, and I think we will end this session in the next 15 minutes or so. But we would like to give you an opportunity to ask any questions or share any of your thoughts before we close this session. But I would also like to tell you that I personally am very keen to take forward this series of discussions. In fact, in a future video live, I would request Amber to do a live while she's baking, because your description of the cakes sounds definitely very, very yummy. So I'd like to see how you make the cakes and also listen to the stories of the people who inspired those cakes. Can you name the other women? One is Noor Jahan from India, Pakistan, but what are the other characters and from other parts of the world that you have inspired you? Name your bakes after, please.
So there's quite a few different women. One is Nanel Mozart. I call it the Nanel, who everybody knows Amadeus Mozart, but most people don't know Nanel Mozart, and it's very sad because a lot of people actually said that she's from Austria, from Vienna, and a lot of people said that she was actually a better musician than her brother was. But at a certain age, as things were at the time, they said, okay, time to get married. And you get married, and she stopped playing, at least publicly. So even though she was very talented, composed and everything like that, she never got to have the same fame as her brother. So that's one of the cakes that I have on the menu, which is very chocolatey cake. That one's one of my most chocolatey cakes, that one. Let me see. Noor Jahan is another one. There's one, Yekaterina Moranskaya, which is a woman who actually I've been thinking about more because there's a TV show called The Great about Catherine the Great. And this woman was not Catherine the Great. Yekaterina also means Catherine. She had the same name. But she was a countess. She had married a count. And they say that she might have actually helped Catherine the Great come to power. And she actually was the head of a National Academy of Sciences at the beginning of the 19th century. So like to put this into perspective, like before you have Jane Austen novels that everybody knows, like Pride and Prejudice, for example, and these women are just thinking about who do I get married to, and they don't have a lot of options. Here's this woman in Russia running an entire Academy of Sciences, the Russian National Academy of Sciences, publishing things, being involved in politics, and I think it's just so amazing to see a woman who was able to do so much. At a time when there weren't a lot of options for most women.
Wonderful. Who do you have from Persia? If you have anybody from Persia, do you have somebody from Persia?
So I did a treat box. Was it last week? Yeah, I think maybe it's last week. Time flies, but after named after Scheherazade, who is the heroine of the Thousand and One Nights. Some people know it as the Arabian Nights. And her story basically is so she's not a real person, but these Thousand and One Nights, most people will know stories like like Aladdin,
Sinbad. Yeah.
Sinbad, exactly. They're all part of the Thousand and One Nights. It's called a frame tale, where it's a story within a story. So what happens is this woman, there was a king who, his wife cheated on him. He was very upset. He killed her because he was a king and they can do that at that time. And he said, I don't want any woman to betray me ever again. So every day he would marry one woman, they'd stay one night, and in the morning he would kill her, have her killed. And this kept happening and happening and happening, which caused a lot of problems in the region, as you can imagine. The number of women was depleting. And one woman, I think her father was the vizier or something, said, I'm going to marry the king. And her father said, no, what are you thinking? I don't want you to die. Don't marry him. Most people would say, yeah, marry the king. But he's saying, no, please don't marry him. And she says, no, I'm going to marry him. See what happens. So what happens is that the first night that she's with him, she starts telling him a story. But before she's finished the story, dawn is coming. And it's time to go to sleep. And she says, I can finish the story tomorrow night. And she starts this over and over again. She'll finish one story and start another, but won't finish it to the next night. So if he wants to hear the end of the story, she has to live another day. So she does this for supposedly 1,001 nights until she runs out of stories. Says, sorry, I've got nothing left. This is it. And she's not sure, like, am I going to be killed now because he has nothing to make me live for? And in the end, he falls in love with her and everyone's happy. But she's a really amazing character. For that one, I was just doing a treat box after her, but I would like to do a cake named after her as well, which I haven't developed yet. But there's a difficulty in saying, does she belong to Iran? Does she belong to Arab countries? Because the 1,001 Nights are mainly Arabic language stories, not Persian language stories. But this king, this mythical king, it was a Persian king. So it's one of those stories that belongs almost to everybody. And again, too, when it first started to be written down, it was mostly an oral story, was actually mostly by Europeans, French and English, especially French, who were writing this down.
Right. And do you know that the Arabian Nights has a connection with Hyderabad?
Really? I don't know this one. Please tell.
Right. So during the time that the Arabian Nights was written, there was only one country or one region in the world that used to manufacture diamonds, and that was Golconda. Right? Golconda was the only known diamond mine in the world at that time, and Golconda basically introduced diamonds to the world. There's a story in Sinbad the Sailor, which is a part of the Arabian Nights, which is called the Valley of Diamonds. Right? And it's a story of how Sinbad gets stuck in this valley. And in this valley, the people have a very fascinating way of mining for diamonds. They train the birds so that the birds go and procure the diamonds from the recesses of the cliffs. Right? These inaccessible parts of the gorge where people cannot go, the birds go, pick the diamonds and come back. And the harvesters of the diamonds would treat these eagles with balls of meat, right? And that was how diamonds were mined. And I was reading through old accounts of the Deccan, and I read that this was how the diamonds were actually mined. In certain river valleys of the Krishna River, when the diamonds were being mined, because you have, when the river Krishna and Penna, they go through these mountains, they create deep gorges, right? And you had diamonds inside some of these crevices where people could not go, and hence these birds were trained to mine these diamonds. So when I saw that this is exactly what the story says, then I put two and two together, and I realized that Arabian Nights basically is a story of travelers. It's basically, travelogue kind of a story. So Arabian Nights was written around the medieval times, and this was a time when you had a lot of Persians and Arabians coming to the Deccan, right? And some of them even had written their travelogue accounts. For example, we have one traveler whose name was Ibn Battuta, and you had another guy called Farishta, and both of them had written exhaustive records of their time in Deccan. And the particular book, which is called Tariq-e-Deccan by this writer called Farishta, he describes in accurate detail how the diamond mining used to happen. So this travelogue somehow reached Persia or Arabia. And I think the story of the Valley of Diamonds was inspired by the description of the diamond mining in these texts, right? And then Hyderabad. So these tales, especially the Arabian Nights, were stories that were told on long journeys. People who were coming from Arabia to India on a ship, right? Every night they would gather and the story would be shared, but not the entire story. The story would continue for several nights. In fact, I think, for nights, for months, the story would continue without ending. And every night there would be a cliffhanger, which would make sure that the people would come back the same time for the rest of the story. And, by the time that cliffhanger got answered, you had another cliffhanger, which would again keep the audience hooked and have them come back for the next night. So this kind of what you call the framing where, you have a story within a story, but the story is exactly stopped every night at a place where, this is something that is followed in television today, just before the break. You have a big revelation, or you have a surprise, or you have a plot twist, and then people come back from the break so that they want to know what happens next. So this is a very old technique, very old tactic that was used, in these medieval stories. So Sinbad the Sailor is basically a travelogue. Sinbad travels to different parts of the world and he has adventures. And I believe most of the stories are based on travelogues. These Arabians, they traveled all over the world because they were the masters of shipbuilding at that time. They were the master navigators. So they connected the West and the East. They were the first people to actually connect the East and the West, which is why a lot of influences like chess, for example, originates in India. It was propagated in the world by the Arabs. The numerical system that we have today, that we call the Arabic numerals, is originally the Indo-Arabic numerals because it originated in India. And it was taken by the Arabs and propagated everywhere. So astronomy, storytelling, you'd be even surprised that the Aesop's fables and stories, folk stories of Europe, you have parallel stories from the traditional Indian cultures, right? So these Arabians were taking stories from there and spreading them in Europe, and European stories in India. So you have the same story with a different cultural context in different parts of the world. And we have Arabians to thank for that. Let's take a question from Zedi Ahmed. Maybe you can read the question and then see if you can answer it. There's also another question from Sendil. It's not a question. Awesome to hear your discussion. Very interesting and informative. But if you scroll a little bit, you have a question from Zedi. He's asking, based on what you've seen, how much of the interpretation of Al-Buraq and the religious sentiment associated with it is influenced by the geopolitics, past or present? That's the question.
Oh, that's a big question. In terms of in the past, I'm not sure. It's hard. It's really hard to say. It's really hard to say in terms of depictions of the Buraq. I guess it depends if you're talking about like interpretations of it in terms of religious interpretation or the way it's painted. I think, is my opinion, that possibly the reason why we don't have, part of the reason why we don't have as many depictions of the Buraq could be that there's a lot more Arab influence right now in the world, especially in the Muslim community, than we used to have in the past. Because, back in the day, they didn't have so much oil money, they didn't have so much power in the Arabian Peninsula as they have now. So I think that a lot of Muslims have been adopting attitudes that before were more common in Arab countries, now are becoming more common all over the world. So that's maybe one way that it's geopolitics has influenced depictions of the Buraq, and why sometimes we don't see as many now as we used to, though you still do, especially in specific cases, such as in truck design in Pakistan, where it is still very common. And in Hyderabad, where it seems like maybe, well, most of those are historical things, but that's very common. And I think too, and I guess also you have, in terms of depictions of the Buraq, there's a lot of connections between India and Iran, because they were so connected back in the day. And I think especially the Deccan, this was an interesting part of my research to see how close were the connections between the Deccan and Iran. And I don't know, but this is my impression that between the Deccan and Iran, they had maybe more amicable relationship than the Mughals did with Iran. I think with the Mughals, they were a little bit more competitive. They still spoke Persian in the Mughal court, so they still had a lot of Persian culture, but I think they were more competitive, whereas I think the Deccan maybe had a little less competition with Iran.
And there's a reason for that. The reason is because the kings of Deccan, they didn't come to the mountain passes. The Mughals, they came to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and,
right.
Most of them, the Mughals themselves are of Mongol descent, but Mongol with, mixed with, the Central Asian tribes. Whereas the kings of the Deccan, which is in the central Indian peninsula, they came straight off the boat, across the west coast of India, we have Arabian Sea, and across the sea, you have Persia. So for them, it was much easier to just get on a boat and come to India. And the kings of the Deccan, the Qutub Shahis, they were all Shia, unlike the Mughals, who were mostly Sunni. And the Shia kings of the Deccan, they came directly from Persia without coming through the mountain passes. So their connection with Persia was always much stronger. And in fact, the khutbah is the Friday prayers in the mosques. They were always taken in the name of the Shah of Persia throughout. So they always held their allegiance and subservience to the Shah of Persia at all times, even while they were ruling regions which were much larger than Persia itself, or the Persian kingdom at certain points in time. Because at that time, the power of the Islamic Empire rested in Persia. At other times it was in Turkey. There were largely historically two regions where the Islamic Empire wielded power from. One of them was the Caspian Sea region, which is Iran. The other one is the Mediterranean region, which is more of Turkey. These were at different points. These were different power centers, Turkey and Persia. Strangely, Arabia has never been historically a major power. Right? Of course, it was a holy land because there was the Makkah and Medina, but there's never the might of Islamic power coming from Arabia. It's only in the last 30, 40 years that Arabic influence started to really take shape. And in India, if you're living in India especially, you can see the influence very clearly. Right? Until a decade ago, people would say Ramzan. Now they're calling it Ramadan.
Yeah.
Right. Until a decade ago, people would wish Ramzan Mubarak. Now they wish Ramadan Kareem. And a lot of these things are changing because, we have a lot of Arabian influence today, and the Persian influence is slowly waning to the influence of the Arabians. But I think there's another question, is there?
Oh.
No more questions. So we'll close the live in the next 5 minutes. Thank you for watching, and thank you for the messages. Some of you said you found the discussion very interesting. Thank you for your comments. Before we close, if anybody has any last comments or questions, please feel free to share them at the moment. And in the meanwhile, Amber, if you have anything to share or anything that you want to speak about, as in the form of closing comments, we can have them now.
Yeah, sure. In terms of what you were saying about Iran, and going back to that question of connections with Iran, it's amazing to hear even more of the political history and the way people are moving around. And one place where connection with Iran really shows up is in art. Like in those dragons that I found, that this style of painting a dragon was straight out of a Hamza of Nizami, of a manuscript painted in Iran. It was exactly the same. It was exactly the same. It looks like we have a slightly unrelated question. Where is the best biryani? Is it in Hyderabad or is it somewhere else? Right.
So this question has been debated for the last half century. And if you ask this question to any random Hyderabadi, he will give you one of the dozens of answers. Everybody had their favorite biryani place, which is different from others. Well, the thing about biryani in Hyderabad is that you have almost 15 to 20 different restaurants, each having their signature style of making biryani, a signature flavor. So among the top five, I would say definitely Shadab in the old city. You have a place called Bawarchi. You have Shag House. You have Alhamdulillah, and then you also have Cafe Bahar. So these are my top five. But yeah, but most people who come to Hyderabad, they sample biryani of every popular restaurant, and eventually they come up with their favorite. And it's different for different people, right? Depending on what kind of biryani you like. So you have another question, Amber. Have you written about your studies anywhere for people who might want to read up more on this topic?
Not really. I actually have two blogs. I have one blog that's been kind of dormant. I have my blog that I'm doing with the bakery, though it's not specifically related to my research. Eventually, my thesis will be published. I'm keeping it on hold for a couple years because I'm hoping to get a couple publications out before I make everything public. But Mama John, you can always send me a message. I have my thesis I can send you if you're looking for information. I have little things here and there that I've written that I could send you.
Right. So thank you so much, Amber. That was a very interesting discussion. It opened up a whole lot of interest in Al Buraq that I've never even heard of before. So thank you so much for that. And I look forward to hosting more such sessions with you, and even people out there who do interesting research or interesting studies like this. I think these are interesting conversations to have. So if you have something that you would like to share, please do reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to discuss these things. We'll keep these conversations going. Hopefully in the future sometime we'll have a baking session with Amber and some stories from medieval cultures around the world. Yeah, so there's somebody who said just randomly and found it interesting. Thank you, Mami Jan. Are you from Hyderabad, Mami Jan? I'm just curious. I don't know your name, so I'm calling you Mami Jan. But there were enough people from Hyderabad and Canada, and that's also interesting to see that people from India, where it's morning, and people from Canada, where it's late night. We get to meet each other and discuss. So thank you for giving those hearts. If you liked, you're from Hyderabad, great. So if you liked the discussion, do give out a heart, and keep following us, and we'll come back with more such discussions in the future as well. Right. Okay, Mom, she's from Hyderabad and Canada. That's very interesting. So she's a Hyderabadi living in Canada, I believe.
Nice.
Quite interesting. So, I find medieval history very fascinating as well, especially because of the richness of storytelling. There's so many stories of so many kings, and political stories, non-political stories, myths, folk stories. So it's definitely interesting to share them with the others and engage with them. We'll close the session for now. It's been more than an hour. 10:53. We started at 9:40, I think. So the video will remain on Instagram. So come back. Feel free to come back and watch it and share it with other people. And keep following us. Have a great day and have a good night for those of you from Canada. Right. Bye, Amber. And once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. So happy to be here. It was such a nice conversation.
Take care, everybody. Good night.